In the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, I got an email from someone in my family that said that drinking water every 15 minutes would keep me from getting the virus. Remember that rumor? Now, I want to repeat that constantly drinking water will not keep you from getting COVID-19. And yet, this was just one of the many, many myths about COVID swirling around on the internet and in social media. And some of them have caused people some real harm. Bad information like this, whether it's maliciously created and spread or innocently so, is a growing problem in our hyper-digitalized societies. It can harm people, and it can harm democracies. I'm Clara Young, and I work in the OECD's Education and Skills Directorate. Today, I talked to Clara Brissin-Boivin, who is Director of Research at Mediasmarts, Canada's Centre for Digital and Media Literacy, and Jordan Hill, who is an OECD analyst currently writing a working paper on digital media literacy. This podcast is the second in a two-part series on disinformation, misinformation, and what education can do about it. So Clara Brissin-Boivin, Jordan Hill, thank you for coming on this podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
So Mediasmarts has a school digital media literacy program called Break the Fake. Now, Clara, what would you teach students to do when they see fake COVID advice, like the one I just mentioned in the intro, that, constantly sipping water keeps you from getting infected with the virus?
It really boils down to these 4 key ways to tell if something is true online, and that's to use fact-checking tools. So you want to see if there are experts who have already done this work for you. Snopes would be an example of one of those. To find the source, so go to the original source of a story, reminding people that what you see in a social media post is not necessarily the original source. So you have to do that work. To verify that source, you can check Google, you can do a Wikipedia search to verify the both authenticity of the source, but also whether it has a good track record. And then lastly, to find other sources. So seek out other news outlets and see if there are other venues that are also reporting on the source, in particular, other outlets with perhaps a sort of different political bent, if you will. And then we want to remind people that each of these 4 tips and tricks only takes a matter of minutes. And in fact, usually if you do one of the 4, you're able to quite quickly verify whether that source is authentic and true.
PISA 2018 revealed some very interesting things about digital media literacy teaching in schools, that more than half of 15-year-old students said they were being taught at school how to tell the difference between biased and unbiased information. But at the same time, the reading test showed that less than half of 15-year-olds in OECD countries could tell the difference between fact and opinion online. So those are kind of unsettling statistics.
Yeah, and one of the challenges when we're talking about mis and disinformation, for example, is that, from an educational perspective, the distinction between mis and disinformation, and just to boil that down really simply and oversimplify it, disinformation is inaccurate or untrue information that is shared with intention. Misinformation is inaccurate or untrue information shared unintentionally. But from an educational perspective, the distinction between the two isn't very relevant because there's no way to tell intent. And that's what you're getting at there, right? It's very difficult for us as users to tell intention behind whether someone was in fact sharing this with intent. And part of that is as users, we're constantly trying to sift through, is this someone's opinion that I just disagree with? And are we just disagreeing on an opinion or a particular subject, or is this in fact like a really dangerous piece of malicious, content or information that something needs to be done about? And so we don't spend a lot of time on that difference between mis and disinformation. Instead, we really want to encourage people to, question, how do we know who or what to trust? It's really about seeking out those sources, as I was mentioning. And one of the things that we really emphasize, especially with young people who are at this critical age of wanting to seek out, worldviews and new ways of knowing and being, is to be critical consumers of information, Asking questions is a great thing, but we don't want to become so skeptical that we don't trust anything. It's a really dangerous place to be in, right? Where you think, that you can't trust anything. So again, those 4 tips that I was mentioning, a lot of our tools around authenticating information and verifying information is about helping people, especially young people, feel confident in being able to determine when something is trustworthy.
About that point that you made, that you don't want young people and children to sort of give up on being able to find good information, isn't one of the worries or something that's connected to this finding that young people tend to be passive on the internet and social media, that they're not really engaging actively and positively in that world?
I'm not sure. I mean, the work that we've done at Mediasmarts, I think, contradicts that a little bit. We've done focus groups and research with young people for over 20 years, and our work, certainly demonstrates that young people are engaging at a variety of different levels. So certainly there's some passivity there, and our most recent work, they definitely have indicated that one of their top forms of engagement is posting and comments, as opposed to, say, like video creation. And of course, that's a little bit more challenging. We'll get in the rabbit hole of some of the reasons for that are around access and tools. But at the same time, we've also heard from young people quite strongly a desire, especially around these authenticating and verifying information skills, for more, particularly more education, more support. They're hyper aware that they need to be very conscious of information seeking online, especially when it comes to school projects. And we've heard from both youth and their parents that, the internet is a really difficult place for seeking information. You've got the world at your fingertips, and that can be overwhelming. There's all kinds of rabbit holes that young people can go down. And, part of that is also understanding the architecture of the online space. So one of the things that we know from our work is that young people use YouTube like a repository of information. From an authenticating and verifying information perspective, YouTube's great for like how-to videos if you want to learn how to sew. It's not great if you want to figure out things like if you have questions about climate change, for example. Again, the architecture, piece is really important as well, to help young people understand how content is recommended to them, how algorithms and their engagement with the space, whether they're liking content and sort of moving that up in the queue in terms of that algorithm, will impact the kinds of information they're getting. These are all the kinds of digital media literacy skills that we need to consider when we're talking about combating, mis and disinformation, but other online harms as well.
That brings me to the point. I came across a public education program in Finland a few years ago that teaches people basically how algorithms work. Should algorithmic literacy be included in digital media literacy?
Yes, I think so. Absolutely. And especially as more and more of our online engagements and experiences and relationships are being cultivated in an algorithmic context, everything we're doing online is being impacted by the architecture of the spaces in which we are engaging. And so when we talk about algorithmic literacy, and we've done a project, a research report was released in 2021 about this, we're talking not strictly about coding and sort of very data science or computer science focused literacy. We're talking about the critical thinking capacities to do kind of what I just described, understand the ways in which algorithms are impacting the kinds of information we're getting, our capacity to navigate within the spaces, advertisements, for example, that are being shown to us. So in that project, we designed a game that was played over 3 phases, focused quite specifically on recommendation algorithms, because we know this is the kind of algorithm that young people encounter the most or most frequently, that helped them, created a scaffolded learning experience so that they could better understand what algorithms are and how they're operating, and then they could think critically about those. And what we saw over the course of that project was really amazing. We did focus groups with youth 14 to 17. And we saw over the course of that gameplay, by the 3rd phase, young people were the light bulbs were going on, right? Where they were very aware of algorithmic bias and how that was impacting not only their experiences, but they were really concerned for youth or other people, frankly, who were already marginalized, and how these algorithms might further marginalize them. And this was one of the first projects where we also saw young people doing a lot of future-oriented thinking. So by that, I mean, we had 15 and 16-year-olds who were saying, okay, this doesn't have necessarily a direct impact on me now, but I can see how I need to be worried about this when, for example, I'm looking to get into a university, or and they might be using algorithms to sift through, entry applications, or I want to rent an apartment, or maybe down the road buy a home, and or all these other implications that they started to think about. They were pleasantly surprised and okay with algorithms, recommending things to them like entertainment videos and content on TikTok. For the most part, that was okay. But they were really disturbed by the way that algorithms were using their information to make assumptions about other people like them. They really didn't like that. They really didn't like the idea that, algorithmic systems were creating pools of information and content about teens so that they could sell things to other teens. Like, they really thought that was quite they used descriptions like that was really creepy. Some of them used, words like this is really evil. I think it really showed the critical need for algorithmic literacy in young people's lives.
And I think there's also a question of where you integrate algorithmic literacy in the curriculum, right? Because the recent curriculum reforms have kind of put it more in the computer science area, but actually it's about broader critical thinking skills, right? And critical thinking is integrated in many different parts of the curriculum. And in that sense, so should algorithmic literacy. It should also be integrated throughout. And I think I like the idea that it doesn't have to be just delivered through digital tools, through digital means. I mean, I've seen interventions using pen and paper and project-based work to really integrate just the ideas behind algorithms and what they can do into education. So I think one of the things that comes out in the working paper already is the idea that you can't just silo algorithm literacy in computer science or computer courses. It needs to be part of the broader critical thinking elements of the curriculum.
Working on pen and paper, could you describe that for us so we get a sense of it? Because algorithmic literacy could be daunting for a lot of our listeners.
So, I mean, the intervention I'm thinking of was an intervention that was delivered in, I think, Korea and Belgium, and it's basically centered around project-based work. So a lot of media literacy is delivered through inquiry-based learning, project-based learning, and different pedagogical techniques that aren't necessarily connected directly to digital tools. So the project's, the game is called In the Shoes of the Algorithm, and it's a design-based game. And basically, the game in this intervention lasts 2 hours. It's run with a pen and paper. And the idea is to split students into algorithm designer teams. And then the teams kind of create their own algorithm by writing down what it would do and the implications of it on a pen and paper. And then they have to argue for or against their own algorithms. And basically, the intervention was shown to lead to an enhanced understanding of the role of algorithms and a more critical approach to digital media, because it was centered on the idea of YouTube content.
What Jordan's describing is also echoed in our own work as well. In this project I was describing, the young people who had any sort of introductory baseline knowledge about algorithms were those who were either at a STEM-based school and or in STEM-based programming. So to highlight that our approach to algorithmic literacy has been to, unfortunately, and I think to our detriment, pigeonhole it as a sort of STEM-based computer science focused, which we definitely need to reassess and readjust. And the game that we played in this project is card-based game, so it's kind of meant to be played with a group of young people together using paper-based cards. And I think that is a really helpful pedagogical approach to this. It automatically makes something scary like algorithms feel more approachable when you're looking at it, outside of the tech itself.
So what I'm hearing is that digital literacy, media literacy, and algorithmic literacy should be kind of all together with critical literacy rather than teaching them all separately. Is that correct?
I think that's, I think I would agree with that, especially when it comes to the issue of disinformation, which is a whole of society issue. Media literacy is just one part of the answer to the disinformation challenge.
How can governments best integrate that into school curriculums?
So in a lot of respects, it's already integrated into many school curricula. media literacy, the skills in media literacy feature in a lot of curricula in many countries to do with national language, humanities, history, for example, fosters critical thinking. I think one of the things that we're seeing at the moment is a lot of curricular reformers making that media literacy connection more explicit.
I can say in the Canadian context, it's really complicated, and I think it's also complicated in other jurisdictions. We've done research looking at the UK and some other places around the world, and part of the complication is that in the Canadian context, media literacy is in the official curriculum of each province and territory. For example, BC's digital literacy curriculum is optional. And Ontario's digital literacy is considered a transferable skill. And so part of the challenge is that while it cuts across all of these jurisdictions, it does so in a way that is non-standardized. Part of the education team's role at Mediasmarts is to make the job of the educator incredibly as easy as possible, to say, here are all the curriculum connections across all the different subject matters, linked to provincial curricular objectives, so that the job of the teacher is quite simple to go, great, I'm going to implement this in the classroom. Of course, this would all be easier if there was a national strategy in Canada that prioritized digital media literacy as a life skill.
One of the things that came through when I was researching the working paper is how few countries have these kind of media literacy strategies. I came across, I think, just 3 in my research, all relatively new.
Could one of the reasons why we're quite behind on this be this assumption that we have that, young people, kids, they're digital natives, they know their way around, they can tell the difference between, what is good information, what is bad information? Could that be something that we need to get past?
I think definitely that's the case. In reference to the algorithm as well, there was some research done that showed that algorithmic awareness in teenagers is still pretty uneven. There are some teenagers who know a lot about it, some teenagers who've never heard the word algorithm or know what it is. And so there's definitely that misconception. And I think we're also reaching a point now where the term digital native isn't just being applied to children, it's being applied to teachers, young teachers and parents. And that's also a huge challenge because, teacher education is also playing catch up with all this extra attention. That's one of the reasons why media literacy needs partnerships with stakeholders outside of schools. It's crucial for implementing media literacy in the classroom to bring in other stakeholders such as journalists, such as charities, NGOs and foundations. For many reasons. One of the reasons as well, I think, is the fact that children generally, or young people generally, have very little trust in traditional media. And that's because they're not particularly exposed to it. And I think bringing journalists into the classroom or inviting them to speak, etc., just getting this interface between these stakeholders is really important for building trust in good news sources and good information sources.
Clara, could you tell me about Mediasmart's work with teachers? How are you training them to teach digital media literacy?
So we have done, in the last 5 or 6 years, 2 training courses in particular for teachers through the CanCode program here in Canada. The first was a program we've called Digital Literacy 101. So it really focused on, it was a series of free digital literacy workshops with faculties of education across the country. So they provided overviews of essential digital literacy skills and competencies to familiarize teachers in training with the digital experiences of youth, and also introduce them to resources and tools that are available through our website, like our media literacy framework. We conducted an evaluation of that training with over 1,000 teachers. We saw really impressive leaps in their reported confidence pre and post workshop. In particular, what was interesting is there was a strong gender gap that was closed. So before the workshop, women indicated that their confidence in teaching digital media literacy in the classroom was significantly below men's. And then post-workshop, the women's confidence level significantly increased from 50% before the workshop to 82% afterwards. The second training is for teachers across the country to help them see how they can integrate media making into their own teaching across all avenues, including assessment. And in both of those training exercises and evaluations, what was loudly echoed to us from teachers was that it's a lack of not just pedagogical supports for them to actually, implement this in the classroom, but also resources and time. Like, we really heard loudly from teachers that this is fantastic and I really want to implement this, but my school really struggles with having the resources to actually allow me to do this with my students, or it takes a lot of time that I, as an educator, don't necessarily have because I have all these other objectives, in terms of curricular objectives that I have to meet. And again, here we are back to this discussion of if digital media literacy is seen as one of those core critical curricular competencies, then teachers don't have to pick and choose, right? I have to do the health lesson, I have to do the science lesson. So of course, what falls off the desk is digital media literacy. And again, we are constantly trying to show teachers you can do both. Digital media literacy cuts across all of these, but that is the uphill battle.
I was just pausing there because I thought, Jordan, I saw you kind of nodded your head when we were talking about teachers and creating media, and so I thought you might wanted to say something.
Yeah, the creation element is really a key part of media literacy. I just wanted to emphasize that because, through creating your own media, you have a better understanding of the whole media landscape, and it's one area that I think is particularly important. And also considering that we see that children are not particularly active in creating their own media, I think it's one area where we can really target that will have a really big effect.
I would say that's the other strong message that I'm getting from this interview is that both students, teachers, well, maybe everybody needs to get more actively engaged on the internet and in social media and not just sit back, but they should be, actively checking information, perhaps co-creating knowledge and making media, making videos, making that sort of thing.
Yes, I would say sort of with two important caveats. One that, of course, we always want to encourage youth and their educators and parents to feel that they can engage and contribute in the online space. But we need to also bear in mind that there are some incredible gaps in terms of levels of participation that cut across all kinds of already existing, marginalizations in our society. So the digital, equity issues and challenges, the digital divides that we are seeing are, echoing all of the sorts of other divides. And by that, I mean, that women and girls tend to be participating at far lower rates than others, as well as, newcomers in a particular country and so on. So we need to keep that in mind. And the other thing is, while we want to encourage folks to engage, we can take the algorithmic literacy piece again as an example and increase their own critical competencies and capacities. We don't want to suggest that, digital media literacy, therefore, is about individualizing any of these kind of problems that we've been talking about, right? I think that's something we need to keep in mind, that yes, we need to build our digital well-being and our online resilience, but that doesn't let platforms or governments off the hook in terms of their role in also both legislating, regulating, and the architectural design decisions that are being made in industry around some of the challenges, mis and disinformation, online hate, and those sorts of things that would hinder a person's capacity to exercise their critical competencies. And I'll just give one other, kind of example that cuts across what I've been saying. We talk a lot about, when it comes to digital divides or digital equity, we tend to focus a lot on access. And we tend to think a lot about, geography and broadband, and those are incredibly important, making sure people have high-speed internet access, for example. But we also need to think about things like access to devices. If a student only has access to a smartphone, their capacity to exercise the digital media literacy skills that we've been talking about are already hindered before they begin. Because if you've ever tried to join a Zoom call from a smartphone, it's not fun.
I think
right?
I have.
Yeah. As opposed
I
to
concur.
That's right. As opposed to if you're, able to learn on a computer or a laptop. And similarly, if you're from, if you're a 2S LGBTQ youth who feels threatened in an online space, your capacity to engage in that space is already hindered. So, we just need to keep those things in mind as well.
Good points. So promoting digital media literacy, digital resourcing to close the equity gap, and government legislation to try to make the online space more inclusive for all.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always say it sounds like it's such a cheesy response, but it's so important to emphasize this is a whole of society challenge, and it needs to be a whole of society response.
Thank you, Clara Brissin-Boivin and Jordan Hill. I'm Clara Young. To find out more about Canada Mediasmarts, go to mediasmarts.ca. To find out more about the OECD's work on education and skills, check out our Twitter page. Our handle is @OECD EDU Skills.